Hello students, I am Dr. Himanshu Kandpal, Assistant Professor English, Government MS College for Women, Bikaner. Today we are going to study the literary term war poetry. The First World War had considerably influenced the poets of that age, and the poets glorified the war and considered it honorable to represent their country in the war and even die for the sake of their nation. The First World War shook the Western world, and the literature during the war often reflects upon and criticizes the horrors of war. The First World War brought to public notice many poets, particularly among men in the armed forces, while it provided a new source of inspiration for writers of established reputation. Some enthusiastic ones even participated in the war, and amongst them, some returned alive and later expressed the trauma of the war through their poetry. These poets were called the war poets or the trench poets or the soldier poets, and their poetry is known as war poetry. The war poetry deals with the theme of war and its consequences. The term war poetry is misleading. Why it is misleading? As the poetry was actually against war, not in favor of war, and attacked the notion of glorification of war. So the war poetry expressed the broadly two phases may be distinguished when we study the war poetry. The first was one of patriotic fervor, almost of rejoicing in the opportunity of self-sacrifice in the cause of human freedom, and a revival of the romantic conception of the knight at arms. Many writers indeed lived and served through the war and preserved unblemished this fervor of the early years. But as the carnage grew, as the destruction grew more appalling, and the end seemed as distant as ever, other poets arose with the declared intention of shattering this illusion of the splendor of war by presenting a realistic picture of the suffering, brutality, squalor, and futility of the struggle. The work of this last group, though at first greeted with angry protest, has probably withstood the passage of time better than that of the earlier. Perhaps we can find something of its realism, and its depth of understanding has found an echo in the experience of disillusioned post-war generations. Here we are going to read some of the characteristic features of war poetry. It is the depiction of the horror of trench life. What is a trench? A trench is a long, narrow channel that is cut or dug into the ground, used by the soldiers in order to protect themselves from the enemy. People often refer to the battlegrounds of the First World War in northern France and Belgium as the trenches. The most noteworthy feature of war poetry is its depiction of the horrifying conditions of the trench life which the soldiers were compelled to lead. The filth, dirt, and unhygienic environment of the trenches was intolerable. Poets like Charles Hamilton, Wilfred Owen, and Sassoon have written very feelingly. They have presented naturalistic and painfully realistic picture about the agony of living in dirt, living in rotten trenches. Realistic presentation of death and destruction. In the war poetry, we find the naturalistic or the realistic presentation of death and destruction, and it talks about the horrors of war, how it deals with why war is responsible for death and destruction, and how it affects the life of not only soldiers but also the common people. War poetry presents harsh reality of the battlefield in a natural manner, using realistic images and thought provoking language. When we read the war poem, we feel that as if we are witnessing the war. We feel like seeing the realistic images and thought provoking language. It gives a very true account of the bloodshed, mutilation, violence, death, and destruction caused by war. The war poets, they try to bring the true account of the horrors of war. Compassion for soldiers. War poetry expresses a deep and sincere feeling of compassion for the soldiers and depicts their state of nervous breakdown and mental shock caused due to constant pressure and fear that they are exposed to. So, the war poetry also talk about the inhuman conditions or the psychological effects. They live in the inhuman conditions, and because of this, because of the death and destruction, and because it lay a impact on their psychology, and this psychological impact results into the nervous breakdown and mental shock, and they for the lifetime they pass through that trauma, they pass through that constant pressure and fear that they are exposed to. Expression of anti-war sentiments. This poetry criticizes the notion of glorification of war. War poetry does not glorify war. It criticizes the notion of glorification of war. It talks about violence, death, destruction, horrors, the inhuman conditions, the horrid conditions in which the soldiers live and fight, and also propagates the message that wars are always destructive and barbarous. It means that there is like war is related to death and destruction. It ends life. It is not the beginning of life, it ends life, and it kills. It not only kills the person, it lays psychological impact on the person who witnesses it. It is barbarous, it is inhuman, it is destruction. It is war is like the destruction of whole humanity. Rich in images and onomatopoeic words. The war poems, they are rich in images and onomatopoeic words. It gives a rich pictorial presentation of war and is also enriched with a huge stock of onomatopoeic words. What is onomatopoeic words? Onomatopoeia is the act of creating or using words. A writer uses onomatopoeic words. It is the act by the writer of creating or using words that include sounds that are similar to the noises the words refer to. In short, it creates a sound effect that mimics the thing described. For example, the sounds like the buzzing sound, hissing, thump, roaring, rustling. The words like splash, gush, swish, whisper. These all are onomatopoeic word, and all the words that I have given the examples, it creates a sound effect that mimics the thing described. Now we are going to talk about the chief war poets, or the renowned war poets include Wilfred Owen, Sassoon, Rosenberg, Robert Graves, E. Thomas, and Rupert Brooke. I'm going to talk about some of the important renowned war poets. Rupert Brooke. Brooke is usually considered typical of the early group of war poets, perhaps because he has written a very nice sonnet, that is, "If I should die, think only this of me," has appeared in so many anthologies. Brooke's poetry is essentially that of a young, cultured man of leisure. Brooke wrote with a youthful, healthy joy in life, a subtlety of observation and appreciation of natural beauty. Now we move to Siegfried Sassoon. Siegfried Sassoon may be said to be based nearly all his most worthwhile work on his experiences in the war. He saw infantry service in Western Europe and Palestine and was decorated for gallantry. First-hand knowledge of the conditions of trench warfare produced in him a bitter disillusionment, a brief period as a conscientious objector, and above all a determination to shock the people at home into a realization of the ghastly truth of wars. If we move to Wilfred Owen, Wilfred Owen was the greatest of the war poets. As early as in the 1910, Owen was writing verse in the romantic tradition of Keats and Tennyson and the influence of French poetry. But the work by which he lives were all produced after his meeting in 1917 with Sassoon. His experience of the trench has brought him rapidly to maturity. With a frank realism, free from violent bitterness of so much of Sassoon's poetry, Owen set out to present the whole reality of war, the boredom, the hopelessness, and the futility, the horror, occasionally the courage and self-sacrifice, but above all, pity of it. He himself wrote, "I am not concerned with poetry. My subject is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity." Some of the memorable poems, if we move further, some of the memorable poems and elegies on the war theme were contributed by Thomas Hardy, Benyon, A.E. Housman, and others. Rudyard Kipling's poetry struck a different and more patriotic note from that of his contemporaries. The Second World War produced a more desperate response regarding war and its ramifications in poetry. Ramifications, it means the act or process of branching out. The poets most commonly associated with are Keith Douglas, Alan Owen, and Sidney Case. This is all about the war poetry and the important war poets. Thank you.